with the Washington Department of Commerce, is with us this evening. Robert is the governor's advisor for trade policy and has advised governors on international trade and trade agreements for more than 20 years now. And he chairs the Intergovernmental Advisory Committee on Trade, which provides state and local views on international trade agreements to the United States Trade Representative. He also reviews U.S. trade proposals to evaluate potential exposure of state laws and regulations to legal challenges. We're awfully happy that Robert was able to join us this evening because this is obviously a very timely and complex topic. And so without further ado, Robert, welcome. Thank you for joining us. And you should unmute. Good. Yes.
Okay. There we go. Well, thanks for inviting me to talk to your group today. It's been kind of a crazy 4 years in trade policy, and I think you're going to see another eventful 4 years under the Biden administration. There's a lot to cover tonight. Overview of the international trading system, the Trump administration's goals, all of the activities during the Trump administration, and what the future looks like. In preparing this presentation, I thought, well, we have to go back and take a look about, what did trade policy look like before the Trump administration? Because it has, hang on a second. Have not seen my video. Let's see.
There you go.
Now, can you see me now?
Yes.
Okay, I got to go back to the. You still see me?
There, yes, good.
Okay. So the Trump administration has been such a break with trade policy prior to this time that I need to look back and review where we were before the Trump administration came into the office. So really the basis began in the General Agreements on Tariff and Trade back in 1948, right after the war, and the U.S. was a main proponent behind that, as well as other institutions that were developed at that time, like the World Bank, the IMF, NATO, and UN. And so that was the first agreement reducing tariffs, and then they had successive rounds of negotiations that led to more tariff reductions. And then as countries started to put non-tariff barriers up to block imports, then it was decided that you needed more agreements and more subjects to cover all these non-tariff barriers. And the last round of negotiations ended in 1995, which ended up with the establishment of the World Trade Organization. So over time, you see that these agreements have been modified or new ones have been added, covering a wide range of topics: goods, services, agriculture, investment. I'm not going to go through them all. Subsidies and countervailing measures, that's where the WTO Boeing dispute falls under. Sanitary and phytosanitary barriers, that's very important to Washington's agricultural industry. Technical barriers to trade. One of the classic examples was that Japan would not let U.S. skis into the market until they've been tested on Japanese snow. So over time, these rules were developed to address situations such as this. Now, throughout these agreements, their core principles, whether they deal with investment, trade in goods, trade in services. And so I put these out there because one of the things I've been thinking about is, well, you have core WTO principles. And when I think about the Trump administration, it is how inconsistent they have been with some of these core principles, which is shaken, the foundation of the WTO system. So one of the core principles, non-discrimination. You can't discriminate between the products and services of different countries. There's certainly some exceptions to that rule. We have free trade agreements where we give tariff advantages to some trading partners that are better than what you get under the WTO agreements, for example. You can't, you have to provide national treatment. So you can discriminate in terms of tariffs at the border, but once that product enters the market, you have to give it treatment for taxes and regulation that's no less favorable than what's provided to domestic companies. Just going back for a sec for the MFN principle, we have the China Phase 1 agreement, which I'll get into a little bit later. But you know, China's committed to buy 200 billion more worth of U.S. products over 2 years. And how can China do that without violating the MFN principle of the WTO? If they're going to buy more soybeans, that might come at the expense of Brazil, or more airplanes, that comes at the expense of Airbus and the EU. Another major principle is transparency and predictability. This is hugely important to U.S. firms. Companies need to have a predictable trading environment. So, for example, tariffs are supposed to be bound at certain levels. Well, certainly the Trump administration has broken those bound tariff levels, and their policy it's been pretty unpredictable. And this is, you know, you're trying to create an environment where you give assurances to companies so they know what they can expect when their products or services, how they're going to be treated by other trading partners. Gradual increase in market access through trade liberalization. I talked about the trade rounds. The last one was in 1995. The new negotiations covering all WTO members have really ground to a halt. It's too complex, too many members. So that's been some difficulty there. Promoting fair competition. This refers to countries allowed to protect themselves from unfairly priced, dumped imports or subsidized imports. So those are the main principles of the WTO. So one of the biggest things that came out of the earlier round of 1995 was a binding dispute settlement system with teeth. Before the Uruguay round, if you received an unfavorable ruling, all you had to do was you could just simply block it. Now, under the current system, at least up until the Trump administration, if you did not comply, then you could face tariffs or be forced to pay compensation or reach some sort of negotiated solution. I'm stressing this because the WTO system is under an incredible strain. The system works where there's a panel ruling, and then there's an appellate body with 3 appellate body members on each panel. Well, since for the last couple of years, the Trump administration has blocked the nomination of any new members to the appellate body, so that the appellate body can't review any case that's brought to their attention. So this means that basically, you know, you don't like a ruling, you just send it to the appellate body and it dies because you can't get it all the way through the dispute, all the way through the system for a final ruling. So this is quite a bit of stress, and this is certainly one of the issues that the Biden administration will have to deal with when they come into office. So the WTO system is complemented by U.S. free trade agreements. Again, there are exceptions to the MFN principle. The U.S. has been, originally this was just basically lowering tariffs between signatories, but because the economy has changed, we have the rise of state-owned enterprises as major players in international trade. as well as digital trade, which was basically didn't exist back in 1995. So the U.S. has been trying to put more rules and newer agreements that cover state-owned enterprises and digital trade, as well as labor and environmental provisions. It's very frustrating because WTO changes are all done by consensus. So just one member country can block new rules. So um, this is the way that the U.S. has tried to alter the international trading system by uh, putting new rules in free trade agreements. As the WTO has expanded in 1995, it's just 123 members, and now it's up to 159. A lot of them are developing countries which have a divergent interest from that of the United States, different focus. So coming into the office, Trump administration, or Trump, was very critical of U.S. trade agreements. He really was focused on the goods trade balance and saw that it had increased after the United States had entered into some trade agreements. So he was threatening to pull out of some agreements and developed his America First, go it alone trade policy with zero-sum view of trade policy where there's just winners and losers. So towards that end, these are goals intermesh here. He came in wanting to renegotiate trade agreements to existing trade agreements to make them more balanced and favorable to the United States. With the end goals was to bring manufacturing back to the country and hopefully reduce the trade deficit. He's also used tariffs as leverage to try and force changes in our trading partner, either by threatening to pull out of trade agreements, which would snap the tariffs back to WTO levels, using national security arguments to put tariffs in place, or what's called Section 301 of U.S. trade law, which has been used to put tariffs on China. We've seen the increasing use of national security for arguments to either impose tariffs, increase reviews of inbound investment, foreign direct investment, or stiffen our export controls. And that's controls of dual use of products that have both civilian and military use. And the fear has always been that importing countries could take that technology to develop their military. Also, it's taken a lot of actions to try and force the United States, U.S. companies to decouple from China, and then focus on WTO reform. There's certainly holes in dispute settlement body itself at the WTO. The first time it was created, I said, it was 1995, and some of the language is not clear about actually how the procedures work. So working on WTO reform, and then trying to add new rules to counter Chinese use of subsidies to state-owned enterprises. And finally, the other thing was to enforce fair trade laws. This refers to the use of tariffs to offset unfairly priced imports or subsidized imports. I won't say much about this other than with bipartisan support, the Trump administration has cracked down on duty evasion, where products that are facing anti-dumping or subsidies tariffs are laundered through a third country before entering into the U.S., being marked as a product of that intermediary country. So this is not that controversial. It's been supported by members of both parties. So these are some of the things it's in order to evaluate the Trump administration policies, we need to understand their goals and also understand some of the choices that Biden will face. So, in turning to trade agreements, the like the first day in office, he withdrew the U.S. from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which the Obama administration had spent years negotiating. It had become politically toxic in the run-up to the election in 2016. Um, this was the agreement was important because we had free trade agreements with some of the countries, but a lot of those rules were updated or were out of date and needed to be updated to reflect, digital trade and state-owned enterprises, as well as the increasing emphasis on labor and environmental protections from the U.S. side. So we've withdrawn from that, but meanwhile, the CPTPP has gone to place, and that's with all the remaining members of the TPP. And then just last week was announced that the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, was reached. And this is an agreement between China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and all the members of ASEAN. Their own agreement, and the U.S. is not a party to either of these, which means that number one, the U.S. is not writing the trade rules in the region anymore, putting us at a disadvantage, and we're also not getting the tariff benefits of breaks from that. So this is particularly important to our agriculture industry because agriculture always seems to face higher tariffs than industrial goods. So Trump was complaining about the increase in the trade imbalance with Korea since we finalized the Chorus Agreement. I think that was in 2012, particularly the expanding trade deficit in autos. So most of the focus on renegotiating this was on autos, basically delaying the beginning of the phase out of the 25 U.S. tariff on imported trucks from 2021. Now it's not going to begin to phase out in 2041. Increasing the number of trucks or cars that wouldn't have to meet Korean safety and emission standards from 25,000 to 50,000 a year. Very narrow focus, very tense negotiations with Korea. Then we negotiated NAFTA, the USMCA agreement as it's called now. Most of the duties had already eliminated under the original NAFTA. Some exceptions with Canada, dairy, poultry. So we increased the amount of dairy products that should be able to be exported to Canada under what's called tariff rates quotas, with a in quota low tariff or zero tariff and a high above quota rate. This is a hugely important to the U.S. dairy industry, but just last week or this week, the administration announced that there's taking its first USMCA case against Canada because it doesn't think that it's implementing the new tariff market access properly. We also received some gains in terms of knocking some wine trade barriers. About half our wine exports seem to go to Canada, but certainly room for more. And we'll see how that works out. I'm optimistic that Canada's finally. These are long-standing issues with wine, and since we're a border state, this should prove some benefits for us. One of the more interesting things was changing what's known as the rules of origin for autos. In order to get duty-free tariffs under the old NAFTA, 62.5% of the content of the autos had to come from North American countries. And now that's been increased to 75%. Meanwhile, there's another stipulation that 40% of autos have to be, the content of autos have to come from workers making $16 an hour. And for trucks, that has to be 45%. So that's one of the biggest things that interesting to watch is going to be how the auto provisions play out. Certainly, we saw some new language in there for state-owned enterprises, basically lifted out of the TPP. This is really not directed at state-owned enterprises in either Canada and Mexico. They don't play a big role in trade, but it's more as a standard for future agreements that ultimately aimed at China. This means that state-owned enterprises are prohibited from, under the agreement, can't receive certain types of subsidies. Other types of subsidies are limited. And then the SOEs have to make their purchasing and sales decisions based on commercial considerations and not discriminate against imports. And this is, you can see how this can be, state-owned enterprises can game the systems. They could say, well, maybe there's a zero tariffs, but I'm just going to source all my inputs from a domestic company. Or I'm going to sell my products at lower prices to one of my fellow companies. And this all comes at the expense of a foreign company. So the other, and probably the most significant commercial aspect of the agreement is the digital trade provisions of the agreement, where you can't, among other things, you can't put duties on digital traded products. You can't discriminate between digital trade products and non-digital trade products. Countries can't force you to hand over source code or algorithms. You can't be forced to keep your data inside the company. This is a problem, particularly for smaller companies that don't have the financial ability to set up servers in foreign countries and keep the data within the country. So lots of great stuff there in the USMCA agreement. A lot of it, again, was taken word for word for TP. It's hugely important for Washington companies. It sets a standard, and we're going to see this language in the U.S.-Japan agreement and U.S.-UK agreement and the U.S.-Kenya agreement. And the other big thing that came out of the USMCA was really strengthening of the environmental and labor provisions of the USMCA, as well as enforcement provisions. To get the agreement through Congress, the Trump administration made concessions in this area that I never thought I'd see happen. So that's hugely important. Now the USMCA is probably the most progressive trade agreement out there. There's questions whether this is a one-off, or will we see these new labor and environmental standards as a condition for future agreements. U.S.-Japan trade agreement, just a small kind of a mini agreement. I mentioned the digital trade provisions that were based word for word from the USMCA. U.S. also reduced tariffs on some Japanese agriculture and industrial tariffs. And then Japan has increased market access for a lot of, important products for Washington State, French fries, barley, wheat, cranberries, blueberries, cherries, and so on. So big gains there. I think the administration felt pressure by pulling out of the TPP and the frustration of their ag community losing market share as Japan continues to negotiate other trade agreements, including one with the EU. US-EU, very small mini deals right before the election, kind of interesting. EU dropped tariffs on 100 million worth of exports from the US to the EU, eliminated those, and the US cut in half tariffs on about 150 million worth of imports from the EU. Very interesting. The focus here was on lobster and Maine, as the EU and Canada had signed a free trade agreement under which EU eliminated the 8% tariffs on Canadian lobster, meaning that the U.S. Lobster exports to the EU declined by 50%. The lobster was also targeted by China as part of the tariff wars, and now with 30% retaliatory tariffs on top of 5% to 7% tariffs on lobster, our exports have dropped by 42%. So a lot of focus on lobster, and including within the U.S.-China Phase 1 agreement, there's actually commitments for China to buy more U.S. lobster. U.S.-Brazil mini deal, announced recently. Just covers customs administration and regulatory coherence and anti-corruption. Then this week, they announced another mini deal, this time with Ecuador, the same 3 topics, plus another chapter on small and mid-sized enterprise. Big one out there is the US-UK trade agreement, which is complicated by Brexit, as well as the fact that, at least temporarily, the UK is going to carry over the EU approach to regulation, which has been incredibly problematic for both US industrial goods as well as agriculture. Like most trade agreements, agriculture is going to be a huge issue to overcome. UK doesn't want to increase market access for our products, and then there's an outcry in the UK about unsafe foods, whether it's beef produced from cows taking growth hormones, or chicken that had received chlorinated treatment. So this is going to be interesting to watch. Don't know when it will get done. Without the concessions on agriculture, I don't know if there's going to be get approval on Congress if and when it gets done. U.S.-Kenya trade agreement, first or second agreement after Morocco with a country in Africa, on the African continent. Talks are proceeding pretty well, but it's with a developing country and new to agreements with the U.S. This one's going to be slow. And there was a talk of a U.S.-India mini deal, but so far I put that down because it is possible that this could be announced in the next month or so, but this remains to be seen. So now turning to the use of tariffs, the administration has tried to do this to either bring manufacturing home, address the trade imbalance, address certain trade barriers, or address national security concerns. Start off with the so-called safeguards tariffs on washing machines, followed by solar cells and modules. And this is up to the president's discretion what to do after receiving a report from the U.S. Department of Commerce, which evaluates whether imports are increasing to the extent that they're being a cause of serious injury or threat of serious injury. And the administration took these recommendations, and the president put tariffs in place. There is a WTO safeguard agreement. So in that sense, this is not as much of a stress on the WTO system. However, they are being challenged, and we could see future retaliation because of our actions and safeguards. These tariffs are time limited. They cannot go beyond 8 years. So turning to the national security tariffs imposed on steel and aluminum, Again, comes from after investigation by the Secretary of Commerce, and then again, it's up to the president's discretion whether to put in place tariffs or not. This has led to immediate retaliation from our trading partners. There is a WTO provision that allows for national security tariffs. That said, our trading partners were so outraged that they went straight to tariffs on this one. Again, stressing the WTO system. And meanwhile, they've also brought cases against us, WTO cases, which of course are stuck in the system because we've blown up the appellate body. But you're putting the WTO in an awful place. The U.S. administration's position is, gee, national security is what we say it is, and you can't review, what we say it is. And but the problem there is, if the U.S. WTO rules against the U.S., then it's certainly going to upset us. On the other hand, if the U.S. rules in favor of us, you could see copycats for whatever. People say, well, we have binding tariffs, but we're going to say bathtubs are a national security issue, so we're going to put tariffs on it. Again, for both the safeguards and national security, tariffs were put on all countries. Section 232, national security, rarely used. It went into place in 1962. 30 cases. The last time there was a ruling was back in 1986. So this just tells you just how odd this was, unusual, I should say. Now, in terms of where the problem comes from, washing machines already had dumping duties. They came from South Korea, as Samsung and LG. But what the Koreans did was they shifted production to different countries and to get around the tariffs, because the tariffs only applied to imports from South Korea. So this, the U.S. industry pays for the cost of the lawyers for the filing the cases for washing machines. So they're kind of playing a whack-a-mole around there. So they're trying to trace the production of washing machines around the world. In the case of solar cells and steel and aluminum, it's mainly due to Chinese overproduction due to massive subsidies. And it's not because the products are coming directly imported to the U.S. We have dumping duties on imports of solar cells and modules and steel and aluminum from China. But what happens is that China relocates production to other countries and then brings it in to the U.S. to avoid the dumping and subsidy duties, or it exports to third countries, displacing those countries' production, and they in turn export to the United States in our industry, or the U.S. exports of these products go down because China's flooding the market. So certainly have sympathy for the industries here, because they are trying to play whack-a-mole. It's very expensive to do that. But there certainly are downsides to this. In the case of you'll find that with the case on the steel and aluminum, certainly we hit our allies, not just China, causing resentment there. Retaliation of tariffs has hurt us for sure. It's upset our trading partners. While they provided modest support for the industry, whether it's washing machines, solar, all these products, you're going to find increase in U.S. employment, productions goes up, imports go down, prices go up. You see, all those positive things for those industry, but all the evaluations seem to say, well, the U.S. economy is as a whole is worse off because the cost of retaliation, the cost of higher prices to either consumers or higher prices for inputs into the final products hurts the position of those industries. So it's pretty clear that overall the U.S. economy is worse off from the tariff. This doesn't mean necessarily that I'm saying tariffs on any one of these projects are bad ideas, because certainly sometimes it's worth it to bear the cost of the increased protection. So I'll just go back one bit. I'll just go to, we had a study by the University of Chicago and Federal Reserve looked at washing machines, and they said, well, raised 80 million in extra tariff revenue and supported about 1,600 jobs. But when you take the cost into account for the increased cost, it comes out to about $17,000 per job saved. So again, there's always these calculations. That's just one study, but tariffs in place. Just looking at steel, similar situation here. You can see since the tariffs were imposed in 2017, we have seen the number of workers, steel workers, gone up by 4,600, 6.8 million metric tons, and increased production. So that's good in terms of the steel industry. In that sense, they have been effective for them. Again, the costs are passed on to U.S. consumers in the form of higher prices or higher tariffs. So I'm not going to get into the details of the U.S.-China trade war. Originally, this was about China's treatment of intellectual property. Either they're forcing U.S. companies to hand over their IP in order to get market access. There's discrimination against foreign firms in terms of licensing their IP in China. Chinese government funds were used to purchase Western companies, U.S. companies, to get their IP. And then of course, there's the other one is to cyber espionage to steal U.S. IP. That was the original explanation. But since that time, the reason for these tariffs is changed. Trump administration has cited, Chinese retaliatory tariffs in response, or Chinese industrial policies, or Chinese not buying enough agricultural products, or importing fentanyl to the United States. So back and forth, ping pong and retaliation. None of the U.S. tariffs were put in place with WTO authorization, same with China. So all this is off the grid in terms of being consistent with WTO rules, undercutting the system. And we're about to have another round of tariffs go in place December of 2019. And when we signed the phase 1 deal with China, I can't believe this is just like a year ago that this happened. So basically, they put a cooling off period. They weren't going to put the tariffs in place that were scheduled to go in place December 15th of 2019, and lowered tariffs on other products. Both sides did this. But at the same time, you can see at the bottom chart that the U.S. average tariff on China, despite phase 1, has increased from 3% to 19.3%. And China on the U.S. Has increased their tariffs on average 8% to 20.9%. Meanwhile, China has reduced its tariffs on imports from other countries, increasing the competitive disadvantage for U.S. companies. So U.S. tariffs still cover about 64.5% of Chinese imports and 90% of Chinese parts and components. And you can see this is part of the administration to encourage U.S. companies to move out of China, hopefully back home, by making the cost of the companies of importing from them higher. So another big part of the phase one agreement was China's commitment to buy 200 billion worth of goods over 2 years, 2020, 2021. Included in that was 40 billion in foreign products. Now these were not, it got pretty detailed, and it didn't cover all products. Some products China doesn't have to do anything, but there's specific targets for certain energy. I put some of the categories down there. As I mentioned before, even lobsters were apparently named specifically. So how are we doing so far? Well, these are figures by the Pearson Institute of International Economics. In terms of total increases, up, we're done 56% on target. Agriculture is doing much better, 71%, but still, overall exports to China are 10% lower than they were in September 2017. Meanwhile, it's interesting to note that China's purchases of goods that aren't covered in the agreement are down 13%, and China is actually increasing those imports from other countries. I will say that China has economy is picking up, and the last month has seen an increase in their purchases. We're going to get closer in agriculture. I think it's doubtful that they're going to make all the targets for all the other products. Certainly, this doesn't come as a surprise for a lot of China or trade watchers. Obviously, the COVID had an impact on things. The fact that I don't think China's taken a Boeing delivery in 3 years hurts them. U.S. has tightened our export controls. This hurts telecom and semiconductor exports to China, which now they need a license to export those products. There's huge demand in China for that. We've seen factors like there's the African swine fever outbreak, killed 40% of China's pigs. So that means there's not as much demand for soybeans, which account for 60% of U.S. farm exports to China. Another thing is that you still have Chinese retaliatory and tariffs in place. That means what's the incentive for the private sector to take on that additional costs? Maybe the state-owned enterprises, because they're government controlled, might get a tariff break or something like that. But right now they only import 20% of the products from the U.S. Most of those to the private sector. So it's not sure how the incentive here to deal with those tariffs. And also, the trade war has caused a lot of Chinese importers to look for other suppliers, and it's not likely in such an uncertain environment that they're going to switch back to the U.S. The whole thing is kind of a step backward for the global trading system. We're going away from towards managed trade. As I mentioned before, it's a violation of the WTO MFN principle, because you're not going to be buying more from the U.S. without discriminating against products and services from other countries. The deal fails. One did not deal with China's industrial policies. This is and subsidies, and this is something that our trading partners, our allies, actually agree with us. And now we made such a big deal of it, and then we cut our own deal based on purchasing that they're going to increase. China's going to increase purchase from us at their expense. Meanwhile, we've kind of dropped the ball on our complaints, on getting China to address those complaints. So another thing is what happens in 2 years with this deal. So I will say that there were some good news. We did open our markets to certain products from China, and China in return drops many of their sanitary and phytosanitary barriers, plant health. That now these are the products that listed here are important to Washington State: blueberries, alfalfa hay, timothy hay, barley, fresh potatoes and for processing and beef. So definitely some good gains to Washington State out of the agreement. So another thing I should mention is that we have seen increases in tariff revenue. This is actually a tax on U.S. consumers and or industries that have to use the imported products from for their inputs. Also, the other thing that's going on, you can see the figure there, 448 billion in compensation for foreigners in 2020. And according to the Congressional Research Service, this is going to violate our WTO limits for agriculture subsidies, domestic subsidies. Each countries are allowed a certain amount, but we've gone over the top of that. So this is a problem for one. We disregarded our commitments. We just won a case in the WTO against some of China's domestic supports. Now we look like hypocrites doing this. So again, this is another stress for the WTO system. So, okay, China decoupling. I already talked about the tariff wars and the fact that going on. We were focused on inputs coming in from China. We've really trying to leverage companies to U.S. companies to leave China. Stricter reviews of inbound investment. There was a 2018 law that updated the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., which reviews inbound investments, tightened things up. We are having an effect on our trading partners. See copycat actions in the EU and Japan. Telecom and high tech, it certainly seems like we're heading towards a world divided by separate internets and tech regimes. We've gone after legal action against Chinese firms, Huawei, arrested individuals for stealing US IP. Again, I mentioned placing Chinese firms on the entity list, meaning you have to get an export license to export products to China. We forbidden U.S. government and contractors from doing business with certain Chinese firms, and we're trying to cut off semiconductors from being inputs into China. And finally, going after some of the Chinese social media companies like TikTok and WeChat, for example. Already mentioned export controls. I will say we're seeing the EU and other countries are doing the same thing in terms of taking withdrawing from doing business with Huawei. We see it's not just the EU, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Singapore, and others are backing off using Huawei's 5G technology when they update their telecom infrastructure. Export controls, yes, EU again is tightening their export controls. So we are influencing the actions of other countries by putting a spotlight on China. Certainly, the administration is trying to encourage U.S. firms to relocate back to the United States. The latest survey out of China shows that only about 3.7% of U.S. companies are planning to move at least some manufacturing back to the U.S. Most, if anything, are moving to either Southeast Asia or Mexico. This could change as if the hardline policy towards China increases. WTO reform. I mentioned negotiating some new rules are in impasse. This is a huge priority for the Trump administration. We need to fix the WTO dispute settlement agreement, as well as we're pushing new rules so we can address China's state-run economy. As I mentioned before, unhappiness with some dispute settlement rulings, and now that appellate body is shut down, so now we're basically it's more might makes right in terms of trade policy, this administration is focused on, criticizing the WTO to be so focused on the development needs of countries, less developed countries, and then criticizing failures of countries to adhere to their notifications to the WTO. Talked about one of the principles being transparency, predictability. If countries make changes to their rules or regulations impacting um, uh, trade, then they're supposed to notify the WTO they show those changes. But so far, the as of now, the administration does not have a lot to show in terms of concrete WTO reform. I will say that there is more support among allies for changes to the WTO. So in that sense, they're moving the ball down. Since the focus was on the trade balance, you could see here that overall our goods trade balance has increased by 100 billion since the administration came into office. It has gone down with China. That's the goods trade balance. The goods and services trade balances is also up by a little under 100 billion. So in that sense, they fell short. But in honesty, this is a quote, some quotes from the Congressional Research Service talking about, I think the focus of the administration was misplaced. We need changes to, most economists agree, it's due to macroeconomic policies, and trade agreements play a very small role in any trade balance. Finally, turning to employment here, we've seen an increase of about 500,000 manufacturing jobs since the administration has come into office. Again, this seems to be most years a continuation from the economic recovery after the crisis in the mid 2000s. Obviously, whether there's other factors at play here for manufacturing. It's not all due to trade policy. It has to do with economic growth, budget deficits, etc. So, turning to the Biden trade agenda, these are mandatory issues with some sort of legal deadline. Obviously, he's said that he's going to focus on domestic investments and COVID recovery from dealing with the pandemic and economic recovery from that. Trade agreements are going to take a back seat, but he's still not going to be able to escape items on the trade agenda. As I mentioned before, the safeguard tariffs can be extended for another 4 years. So far, the Trump administration has not acted to do so, and it might leave this up to the Biden administration. But this is certainly something that I'm watching. I think Biden would be less inclined for the solar safeguards, given his focus on climate change. Authority expires of June 30th. We've got negotiations with the UK and Canada, and those probably will not be completed before that. Biden says trade deals are going to take a backseat when he wants to build support for investments in the U.S. economy and workforce training. So we don't know where that's going to show up. Social Security investigations still going on along the lines of the aluminum and steel ones. Those reports and recommendations will be coming out. Biden will have to deal with that. The phase one are at the end of next year. Huge issue coming out there. We've done a Section 301 investigation. Again, Section 301 is original law that we used to put tariffs in China, into digital services taxes that are being filed. France and then other EU countries copycats around the world, Indonesia and Turkey, and these typically target digital service above a certain income, which happens to hit U.S. companies like Google and Amazon and so on. So there's a lot of outrage in Congress from both parties that believe that the U.S. companies are being unfairly targeted by our trading partners. So the investigation will be completed, and then it'll be up to, I think it's going to be the Biden administration to determine what action to take. We've started a Section 301 investigation of Vietnam allegedly undervaluing its currency and participating in legal lumber trade. This is something that, again, the Biden administration will have to pick up. And finally, there's other things that are not mandatory, but Biden did promise to spend another $400 billion over several years to use government purchasing to prop up U.S. Industries. This is another potential WTO stresser because under the WTO government procurement agreement, with some exceptions, we agreed not to discriminate against the products and services of other suppliers. So problem there. Aluminum and steel tariffs. Again, it's up to the president's discretion. When he comes into office, he could end those on the first day. He certainly he said he's not going to make any quick decisions on those tariffs or Chinese tariffs. But certainly that's a big stressor with our allies in particular. He'll have to deal with the WTO reform. Right now there's no director general. I think he'll move forward and get to some agreement with other countries to see who's going to lead the WTO. And there's the reform of the dispute settlement body itself, as well as how to deal with update the rules that cover China's state-driven economy. Again, for other agreements, will he, there's always been talk about rejoining the TPP. We know we're losing our competitive, we're at a competitive disadvantage in the region because of that and on RCEP. We've got Kenya and we have the UK agreement out there. What's he going to do about those? Then there's the Boeing Airbus dispute is still a problem out there. We have placed tariffs on 7.6 billion of imports from the EU, and they've placed tariffs on about 4 billion of U.S. exports. And USMCA enforcement, we already, as I said earlier, we already have a dairy case in the works announced this week. I hear that pretty soon there's going to be at least one labor case against Mexico, which will be a huge test to see how these new labor provisions and enforcement provisions work. And certainly a lot of political spotlight on that. And finally, how do you deal with China? So just on a concluding note, I want to put a quote here from the outgoing head of the WTO that talks about how do you deal with a problem like Maria or China in this case? They have not accepted disciplines on state aid. The rules they've gamed the system, so it's just not sustainable. So dealing with China is going to be a big driving force behind the administration's trade policy and approach to EU and allies and other things, the WTO. It's going to be China, China, China in the background. So with that, I will try and stop my screen sharing and go back to just hopefully video.
Thank you very much, Robert. Oh my gosh, complicated. We do have some questions in the chat room for you. So let me go into the chat room. Did non-tariff barriers agreement lead to protecting abusive working conditions and wages in certain countries? That is a tendency to look the other way.
I don't think the well, non-tariff barriers. I mean, you can get to, there's lots. You can get into services, you can get into goods, but I don't think that I would put non-tariff barriers in the same group as abusive working conditions. That certainly does reflect, impact trade. Certainly, you know, certainly one of the problems we have with China is they produce so much that they can't consume it in their own country. So to keep their growth going, they got to export it to other countries. And part of the reason is domestic consumption is so low. The workers get paid more, below what they should be getting. There's taxes on consumption. So all this depresses consumption. So that's kind of related, you know, it's certainly the wage rates and the treatment and the working conditions, which allows China to produce lower cost goods, impacts trade. But
Right, and
And,
Robert,
and a follow-up, just a quick follow-up to that. Amy has a question for you too, but your impressions of Biden's ideas for the next U.S. trade representative?
I think it's a great choice. Catherine Tai, you know, she was Mandarin speaker, did China enforcement for USTR for years, which is going to be the focus of trade policy. Then she was on the cutting edge on the House Ways and Means Trade Committee, working out the labor and environmental provisions for trade agreements. And this is incredibly important to see whether, is this going to be a new standard for new trade agreements? It's going to be interesting to see, or is this a one-off? You know, it seemed like the Republicans in the administration were so desperate to get the USMCA through that they took all these things. I saw these proposals, and I'm saying that's not going to happen, and then it did, and I'm just stunned by it. But yeah, I think she's a great choice.
Go ahead, Amy.
great. So Robert, we have a question. How do all of these trends and changes affect Washington State specifically?
Well, certainly, if you look at the trade numbers, Washington has just cratered, or exports have cratered. A lot of that is Boeing. Exports have gone way down. Certainly the Chinese tariffs, when at the end of 2019, I calculated that it depressed about 2.5 billion in Washington exports. So that's a huge thing. Unpredictable environment out there under the Trump administration. You know, it's like, okay, China's going to be purchasing more ag products. Should I plant more crops? Which type? But it could change in a second. So there's a lot of uncertainty out there. So that's had a huge impact on certain industries in particular. The USMCA, you know, in terms of the economics of that, not much on the good side. I don't see a lot of changes that impact Washington State. As I mentioned, wine and wheat, and maybe a little bit of dairy. Digital trade, you know, it's hard to measure the digital services exports. I saw one figure that Washington State exports digital services about 2.6 billion a year. Well, you don't have any rules out there, and that's incredibly difficult environment to live in. So some of the provisions of these trade agreements where are really welcome to our digital service providers. So that's huge. You know, steel and aluminum, you know, we do have, you know, we have that the aluminum plant that shut down in Ferndale. You know, steel, we do have steel production there, but again, we have a lot of companies that use steel and aluminum for inputs into their products. So it's hard to see.
And then we have a question about WTO. What is the likelihood of a new international trade system emerging to replace WTO, especially in light of COVID issues, such as supply chain vulnerability and international greenhouse gas concerns, et cetera?
Well, it's interesting because I don't think the WTO will go away. There's too many countries in there that see its value, particularly developing countries. I do see that already the EU is reaching out to Biden, talking about wanting to do a dialogue to confront China on technology and telecom, unified front. And this is something that Biden will respond to because he says, we need to work with our allies. He's a multilateralist, and when you're just with the U.S., it's 20 to 25% of our GDP. When you work with our allies, we've got 50 to 60% of the world GDP. You have more effect on China. Going alone against China is not going to work. But they are talking. The EU is talking about a common approach to technology, and there's also talking. They want to talk to the Biden administration about dealing with climate change, including carbon taxes. Janet Yellen, Treasury Secretary, is behind that idea with some sort of border tax adjustment. So they want to make a WTO climate. So there's going to be cooperation, I think, on climate change. Does this mean maybe the solar safeguard tariffs go away? I have thoughts. Well, what happens if the EU and the US set up their own WTO system with new separate system without without China, and you have new rules dealing with state-owned enterprises? Don't know if that's really viable. I mean, the Obama strategy was, okay, we can't change the WTO, state-owned enterprises. It needs a consensus. China's going to block it. So what we're going to do is we're going to negotiate the TPP with the Asian countries. And we're going to do TTIP with the Europeans. And what we're going to do is include digital trade and state-owned enterprise rules in there and basically create our own set of agreed rules outside the WTO. And if China's going to want to join that, you have to abide by those provisions. I do think that will be more of the Biden administration approach. He did support TPP. It's politically toxic. I don't see him anytime soon saying, let's go back to TPP, but certainly that is something that I think he's talking about. U.S. and the allies have to create the rules. Well, how do you do that if you can't do it in the WTO? Well, you say he's not going to do any trade agreements, at least not right away. But if you can't do it in the WTO, then you have to do it separately. And that might be the TPP type of deal and sort of agreeing with the EU. But, negotiating with the EU is very difficult. I mean, we have such a different regulatory environment to approach the regulation that, that's the way to go. Whether it's feasible or not, we'll see. It's hard enough just trying to negotiate that part with the UK.
Go ahead, Amy.
Well, we have a couple of questions that I think kind of fit together more on the Biden administration in terms of if you want to speak at any more depth about what major changes you think the Biden administration will make.
Well, I think he's going to, I think he realizes that the U.S. economy is not really in position, is not well shaped to handle the downsides of international trade. We spend 20% of what the EU does on workforce trade. We need to invest in certain critical industries, AI, trying to keep up with China. So there's certainly a lot of, starts at home, is what he's saying, and getting your ducks in order. And then maybe you can open up the world more. But you have to have some more support to workers and communities and industries so that we're in a better position to compete against China and others.
And we have another question. What do you think would be realistic for the Biden administration to trade for lower tariffs on China? And do you think he will pursue the Trump administration's movement toward tariffs on Vietnam?
Well, we'll start with China. He's already announced that he's not going to make, any quick changes to tariffs. Aluminum, steel, he's caught between, not, upsetting the unions versus the need to reach out to allies. With China, he said, I'm not going to make any adjustments right now. You might make selective adjustments, but really, for now, at least he's going to keep the tariffs in place. I don't think he's going to back away from the phase one agreement purchasing thing. That's politically toxic to do so. And I think, if he does, he can't appear soft on China for any reason, because I think Trump is going to be out there on Twitter, and a lot of the Republican candidates for the next election, Rubio and Cruz, are China hawks. So they're not going to give him a lot of breathing space to pull back from the hard line on China. Now, what I think he might use is use China as the kind of the boogeyman to try and work on his domestic agenda. Say, hey, we got to reorganize our society to better compete in a globalized world, and got to take care of China, our biggest competitor. But no, I don't see any quick changes on tariffs on anybody, but I think it's very problematic for him to walk away from the phase one deal and any of the tariffs on China.
So Robert, we have a question about to what extent are pharmaceuticals and biologicals included in these agreements?
Oh, let's see. So they are in there. The USMCA, the Democrats once they got their hands on the agreement, they insisted on removing the 10-year data exclusivity period for biologics. That was in the original NAFTA USA as negotiated by the Trump administration. And the House Dems said, well, that's going to cause prices to go up and slow down generics coming into the country. I'm sure this was something, again, that the Republicans didn't want to give in. So is this a one-time only on for the USMCA because the need to get that through Congress? What's going to happen in the UK agreement? What's going to happen in the Kenya agreement? Biden's, is not going to come into office and say, "Hey, okay, let's sign this agreement that Trump negotiated and rush it through." He's not going to do trade agreements very quickly. He certainly, why spend the political capital giving, win to something the Trump administration agreed to? So he's going to go through that. I think he's going to look at the biologics data exclusivity and have it reflect what the U.S. language in the USMCA, or the lack of language in the USMCA, because that's been, this is the IPR when it comes to pharmaceuticals has been a very heated issue in the TPP discussions, as well as earlier agreements, and now with the USMCA.
And so we have this question. Under Trump, we hit China with tariffs. They punished our farmers. We bailed out our farmers with subsidies. What's the lesson here?
Well, yeah, it's funny. I just remember I saw something that the amount that we spent on bailing out our auto industry is so much smaller than what we've done for our pharmaceuticals. to their farmers, and where's the outcry? But the lesson here is, boy, I mean, and why just agriculture? Obviously, this administration favored agriculture because everybody else was left hung out to dry. So I think the lesson is look before you leap. I mean, I did you really think that China was not going to respond in kind? Did you really not think they weren't going to hit politically sensitive products like agriculture, always number one on the list? Just even in the EU, the WTO Boeing dispute, the EU is hitting ag products, and they target certain states for certain senators. So it just, look before you leap. You got to realize that first industry that's going to be targeted is going to be agriculture.
Is there one last question, Amy, from the chat room?
No, I think we've gotten to all of the questions.
Oh, good, because I feel like we really worked you over, Robert.
Fine.
but complex topic. Thank you very much. I feel like I know at least 90% more about trade than I did before this. And we just had a chat come over from one of our attendees. Awesome, Robert.
So, lot to cover, very complex in a little bit of time.
Yeah, it is. And very timely, both the topic and in wrapping this up, because we are just minutes away from saying goodnight. I will just remind our attendees that next month we'll be back on our regular third Thursday of the month. That'll be January 21st. Our speaker for January is St. Martin's Professor of Anthropology, David Price. And I believe he's going to be talking to us a bit about the use of anthropologists by the CIA in the late 1900s. So should be very interesting. So once again, Robert, thank you so much, especially coming out during holiday season for this. It was very interesting, and we appreciate you very much joining us. Thank you all for coming. Hope to see you again next month. Thank you. Good night.